Well, may I just comment on that beautiful liturgy and to thank everyone, each and everyone who contributed to it and created such a beautiful atmosphere of peace amongst us. On a slightly practical note, there are some people who are arriving late, and of course, if you do see someone arriving, would you please move in a little bit and allow them to move in with ease. We move now to a very important aspect of the convention, and that is the keynote address by Cardinal Kevin Farrell. And I would like to have a few words of introduction. A keynote address communicates the underlying tone of a convention and brings to the fore the core messages or themes that are to be shared through dialogue at the gathering. This convention is very fortunate to have a keynote speaker of such standing as Cardinal Kevin Farrell, former Bishop of Dallas, Texas, who was inducted into the College of Cardinals by Pope Francis in November 2016. Today, Cardinal Farrell is the Prefect of the Dicastery for the Laity, Family and Life, which Pope Francis announced in August 2016. As the Dicastery has responsibility for, and I quote, the promotion of life, an apostolate of the lay faithful, for the pastoral care of the family and its mission according to God's plan, and for the protection and support of human life, Cardinal Farrell is perfectly placed to guide us on a path of meaningful dialogue rooted in gospel values. Now, earlier in the week, I listened on YouTube to the blessing that Cardinal Farrell delivered at the University of Notre Dame class of 2017 commencement ceremony. There he invoked the principle of active participation by Notre Dame graduates in the life of the American nation. Of course, that same principle applies to ourselves in our land. So, Your Eminence, you are most welcome, and I now invite you to deliver the keynote address.
Good morning, and thank you all especially for being here today. This is such an important gathering for the church. Just a few moments ago it was said that my job includes promoting the laity in every aspect and ensuring that they play an active role in the preaching of the gospel and the living of our faith. That is precisely what our vocation within the church is. And I am so pleased to see a gathering such as this, because it means that the church is alive and well, and that you all understand what your mission here is here today. It is to live up to the commitment that we received or we made when we were baptized into the church. We must be active members of the church in our world, in our communities, in our families, each and every day. That is our vocation, and that is why it is so important that we have gatherings such as these where we can come together and speak to one another and speak to those who run our parishes and who are bishops and who are cardinals in the Holy Roman Catholic Church, and to tell them what the reality of preaching the gospel is like. So I thank you for what you do. I especially want to thank His Grace, the Bishop of Down and Connor, Bishop Noel Traynor, for his kind and fraternal invitation to me to share some thoughts with you regarding this pastoral concern that Pope Francis has brought to the fore in convoking 2 synods, of which I will speak later, and has written this document about the pastoral care of the family in the world today, of marriage and the family. There is nothing as important as this for Pope Francis. There should be nothing as important in our lives, in our diocese, all across the world, in our churches, as the promotion of the family and of the sacrament of marriage. I want to thank, above all of you who are here present and who work in our parishes across the diocese and many other dioceses here in Northern Ireland. It is also, I want to thank many of the bishops and priests who are here today, and also members of the ecumenical, our Christian family, who are present with us today also. This celebration of this year's Faith and Life Convention brings us together to reflect and to discuss the meaning of faith as a reality which is lived within the family and which is expressed in our society today. There is an old saying that says, what the family is, the society will be tomorrow. That is so important. And if we all recognize the situation of our culture, the situation of our society across the world today, we know that the root cause of many of these ills can be solved by promoting and strengthening family life. What the family does, the family is the creator of the society in which we live. Amoris Laetitia is the document which is supposed to guide us all in the future as to how we will do this work. And I would like, rather than read with you the document Amoris Laetitia, I would rather explain to you some of the underlying issues that made this document what it is today. Never before in the history of the Catholic Church has there ever been so much consultation about a document written by the Holy Father or written by the promoted, edited, and published by the Church as Amoris Laetitia. It certainly stands out for the wide consultation that took place. Think for one moment that Pope Francis, and later I will explain this point, but Pope Francis, when he became Pope, he saw that the number one issue was the family, was marriage. And so he convened 2 synods, not one, but 2 synods. He made the fact that there'd be wide world consultation among families. I was still in the Diocese of Dallas, Texas at the time, and we must have had about 15,000 responses to the questionnaire before this synod took place. How we put them all together, I don't know, but we did do a summary of them and send them off to Rome. What happened after that, I have no idea. But I will say there was the opportunity for consultation across the world. Today, you are doing exactly what Pope Francis called us to do. You're looking at a pastoral issue, you're discussing it, and you're about to set the road ahead. How it's going to be, how are we going to do this as a community, as a diocese, as a church? Pope Francis is in charge of the Universal Church, and he will do that also when at the gathering of the families in Dublin in August of 2018. He wants to set a path forward to improve, and we all must participate in this. We had one consistory of cardinals, which is a fancy word for a meeting of cardinals, to discuss it during 2 days. We had 2 synods. We had innumerable consultations by theologians, by teachers, by ordinary, everyday Catholics all across the world. And finally, we have this document. This document is the most legible, in my opinion, having read most of church documents. I can tell you, there is no document as legible, as easy to understand as Amoris Laetitia. It doesn't need a PhD or a doctorate in theology to understand what the Pope is talking about. As a matter of fact, he doesn't use big, complicated concepts or words. It's simple, everyday language. He says, he makes comments, as you have all heard on many occasions. Let the plates fly, throw plates at each other in marriage, but never forget, never go to bed without asking for forgiveness. He is that practical. I don't think he's ever put together, some complicated text that we need 5 or 6 theologians to interpret for us. No, that's not his style. I invite you all to read it. I know that the majority of Catholics have only read what they read in the newspaper. Bad mistake, because they have only read chapter 8. You need to read chapter 1 through 7 and forget the footnotes and forget all the complicated other little small issues on the side. You need to read the document. Please read it. That's the only thing I hope to gain from speaking to you today is that you will read this document yourselves. You don't need me to interpret it. You don't need anybody to interpret it. It is simple. Allow me just to touch on 3 points. First of all, I'd like to put the document into its historical context. Then I'd like to speak for a few moments about the pastoral theology and the methodology that Pope Francis proposes in Amoris Laetitia. I'd like to make a brief mention about the philosophy or the theology of the Synod, and then I would like to conclude by urging you all to please support and attend the World Gathering of the Families in Dublin. I know Father Tim would never forgive me if I didn't have a few commercials in this talk about Dublin. Okay, the first point. I believe that Pope Francis is he's like a triptych of 3. He's one of a triptych of 3 great popes that we've had. You had St. John Paul II, we've had Pope Benedict, and now we have Pope Francis. Just think back, as most of you will remember, John Paul II. John Paul II lived, if you think for one moment, through the Second World War. He suffered tremendously and was ordained a priest under communist rule. Everything in that community, everything in that society, in that nation was contrary to Christian principles and values. John Paul II, that's the world he knew. He knew Poland, he knew where he lived, he knew the suffering of the church, he saw the reality of the problems that the people were facing. He becomes Pope, and his greatest task as Pope was to describe and to codify what the church actually teaches. He wanted it all in one book, simple to read. And so was born the Catechism of the Catholic Church. It was to gather together all the teaching of the Catholic Church. You want to know what we teach? Here's the Catechism of the Catholic Church. He spent the greatest part of his pontificate developing this catechism and improving it. He revised the compendium of the social teaching of the church also. His two great works were the Catechism and the Compendium of the Social Teaching of the Catholic Church. And he revised what's known as the Code of Canon Law. His thought and his vision was to bring together all the teaching of the Catholic Church, so it'd be in one simple format. Pope Benedict came along, and Pope Benedict also lived in the Second World War in a different environment, but he became a theological professor, a great mind, a brilliant man, one of the kindest people that you will ever meet. But his task was to explain why the church lives and teaches what it does. He wanted to explain what Pope Benedict, or what Pope St. John Paul II put all together in. He wanted to explain it. And he himself said that his four greatest works of theology were, number one, the person of Jesus Christ. He wrote these books on Jesus Christ. Second one was on faith, on hope, and on charity. They, according to Benedict himself, the Holy Father, they were the greatest and the most important books he has written on Jesus, faith, hope, and charity, explaining why we believe what we believe. Now we come to Pope Francis. Pope Francis works tirelessly, in my opinion, as a living parable about how we should live, what we believe, teach, and celebrate. In other words, Pope Francis is explaining things by living. Why is he the most popular, according to Time magazine, person in the world? Why is he the person with the highest credibility rating in the world? Because he is what you see. You see him walk around, you see him in the square. He sees somebody who's in pain, who's in suffering, or who's going through a bad moment. He makes innumerable telephone calls all over the world, but he makes a lot of them, I know, in Rome. He hears about somebody who has a relative sick, ill, dying, whatever. He will call them on the telephone. He's a living parable of how we should live what we believe. He wants our Catholic faith to be lived, not just to be known or to be stored in a book, but actually lived. And that is the greatness of Pope Francis. He also comes, and this important point, he comes from a new world, what we call the New World. We've known it, of course, for over 500 years, but it does contain the largest concentration of Christians in Latin America. Is the continent with the largest concentration of Christians in considering the whole world. He was the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, and in Buenos Aires he saw the effects of poverty. He saw what unemployment was doing to people. He saw what violence and drugs were doing to people. He saw the ecological devastation of the country. And above all, the one thing that made him suffer most, in his own words, were the destruction of the family and the destruction of marriage in Argentina. That when he was the Archbishop of Buenos Aires. When he was also the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, he gathered together. He was the one appointed to finally edit and prepare a document known as the Aparecida document, which is very important to understand Amoris Laetitia. You have to read that document too. So that's two pieces of homework for you today. But above all, I want you to read Amoris Laetitia. But the Aparecida document, which was a synod, a gathering of all the bishops of Latin America to study and understand what was happening to the church. Where was the word of God being preached and how successful was it in all of Latin America? when it came to the point of the family, he was distraught in many ways by the fact that he heard from bishops and lay people all over Latin America that the Word of God was not being communicated with joy and with happiness and positive values. And so, when Pope Francis later became Pope, what was his intention? To preach the Word of God with joy and with optimism. And yes, we can all see in the world that we live in today, each one of you can see in your own city here in Belfast, the pain, the suffering, and in the families, how many families are broken. And let's look at the situation. Let's judge that situation, but let's do something to improve it. And that's what Pope Francis set out to do. He kept saying that the Word of God has to be preached with joy. We all know that there are difficulties, but don't come along and be more depressing than the situation already is. Improve, make it better. And so he invites us all to walk with him as we walk together to improve this situation of our families in the world today. Pope Francis certainly has made great efforts in his desire to let the Word of God be known and to live it in everyday practice. But when he becomes Pope, the first thing he wants to do, he couldn't do it in the first year, was to convoke 2 synods on the family. That's what he wanted to do. From the very first day, he wanted to study the family because he saw that this was the hope of the future. And it is. And I can tell you, having spoken to him many times about the World Gathering of the Families, he has in the back of his mind that this is the most important thing that he can do. The one message he wants to leave to each and every one of us and to the whole Catholic world is that we've got to work to improve our marriage relationships. We've got to improve the value and the principles on which marriage is lived. That's where his focus is. And that's why I invite you all, and I am so pleased to see so many of you here today as you work in these ministries within the diocese and within your diocese, within your parishes. The lay people have the obligation through baptism to teach the Word of God in the practical reality of the world today, not in the world of books and the world of lectures, etc., but in the reality of every day. And so he calls on 2 synods. It's historical in the sense that it was the first time that there was going to be worldwide consultation. He gathered the cardinals together and, proposed this idea. They had all kinds of concerns and objections, as they always do. But then he decided to have the first synod, and then he said, I want consultation of the whole world, and let it happen. And it did. The synod was something that where you had these bishops gathered together, but it was focused about what the consultation had been about in every diocese. And so these were some of the pastoral issues that were brought to light. But when we talk about these 2 synods, you have to keep in mind, synods have always been, and this is an important point, have always been a part of our tradition. They were abandoned for a few hundred years. But going back to the Acts of the Apostles, it was a gathering where Peter and Paul and a couple of the apostles got together to discuss the way forward in particular pastoral situations. And through the years, it took Paul VI, Pope Blessed Paul VI, After the council, when the council told us that we had to have these synods, regular meetings, to convey the truth and to convey the pastoral concerns of the people, then we had Pope John Paul II, who promoted the synods and established an organism within the church to promote them. We had Benedict, who made the synod become a gathering and an exchange of ideas. And it was Pope Francis who inherited the content of the synod on the evangelization, whereby he then wrote the document Joy of the Gospel and Joy of Preaching the Good News. And so we had Pope Francis in the last synod. He was the one that opened up the synod to an interchange of ideas, to discuss the pastoral problems like you do here today. And so I would hope that you would all consider and give this the importance that it has, even within your local churches. It's important to point out, of course, that the synod was not something to discuss, as the media, news media will say and do many times. It will talk about doctrinal changes in Amoris Laetitia. There are no doctrinal changes in Amoris Laetitia. When they speak about one aspect of Amoris Laetitia in chapter 8, it is something that dates back to St. Augustine, and especially to St. Thomas Aquinas. The need to form consciences and the supremacy of the conscience of the individual. And therefore, it's not a change in doctrine, but what it is, above all, is a change in the pastoral approach to marriage and the pastoral approach to families. Allow me to talk for one moment about what this pastoral approach is. In the first place, I'd like to talk about the pastoral theology behind Amoris Laetitia. What does Pope Francis really think when it comes to preaching the Word of God? I've already said he preaches by what he does more than what he says. It goes with his title of Francis. You know, I preach, and sometimes to preach I even use words, was the quotation of Pope Francis, not of Pope Francis, of Saint Francis. But yet we have pastoral theology. It is inevitable in all of our communities that couples will face many challenges in our society. As I have previously stated, it's not a question of reminding them about doctrine, but rather it is a question of accompanying them every day in the struggles that they have. If this were a black and white issue of just saying either you live according to the doctrine or you don't live according to the doctrine, the synod would have been over in 24 hours. It was not about doctrinal points. It was about how we should preach the Word of God and how we should accompany couples in everyday life. I would bring you 3 examples. Number 1, it is the realization of what took place between Jesus and the 2 disciples who went on the road to Emmaus. Remember that story in the 24th chapter of St. Luke's Gospel. It is about Jesus encountering, listening to the apostles. The Gospel tells us they were distraught. They had left Jerusalem. Their Savior, the hope, he'd been crucified. It was over. They were going home. They were going back to their fishing nets. But it was Jesus who listened to them patiently while they walked a day's journey He listened to them. He never told them anything. He just discussed with them the text of the scriptures. And then they went to they had a meal. And the breaking of the bread is described in the gospel. And then it was only the next morning that they realized, were not our hearts burning as this person accompanied us? This is the way we have to accompany those who face difficulties in marriage and in the family life today. We need to accompany them. We don't need to throw a book of rules at them. We don't need to quote the Constitution. We need to speak to them about, we need rather to accompany them, to listen to them, and bring them to the realization of what the truth of the gospel is. That does not take place in a meeting with a priest in a parish over 15 minutes or having a cup of coffee. It may take years. It may take months. It may take days. But the important point is Jesus listened. The second example I will give you that should be followed also in our attitude of how we should do pastoral ministry in our parishes today is again the attitude of Jesus. When he encounters the adulterous woman, here this woman is accused and is threatened by the supposedly enlightened religious leaders of the time. They're all there in a circle surrounding this poor woman. All of the intelligentsia of the day. And she encounters Jesus there. And they look at him, at Jesus, and she looks at him. No words are exchanged at that point. He just begins to write on the ground. His heart, he didn't condemn the person immediately. He never condemned her. He just said, go and sin no more. It was that heart, that way of explaining. He didn't say it was okay what you did. He never said that. But he did understand the reality of everyday life. And he did understand what this person was going through. And he did understand the diverse situations that we may encounter each and every day in our own daily and personal lives. But that was his attitude. He said, go, sin no more. Did she not sin no more? We don't know that. Chances are when somebody is in a habit of sinning many times, they're not going to stop on one occasion. So that needs to be in our heart. And the third example of the pastoral care of Jesus can be seen in the parable of the prodigal son. The father every day would go to the front door of the house and look out into the distance to see if his son would return. When he returned, he opened his arms to receive him. He never asked him, where have you been? What have you done? But he entered him back he brought him back. He put a cloak around him and he brought him into that community. He brought him in to have a meal with him, to share with him, to integrate him back into the family again. Three concepts that should govern and are the three underlying parables that Francis always uses to explain the person of Jesus Christ and the pastoral theology that underlines Amoris Laetitia. This is what we need to do. This is how we need to act. And so I would propose to you that when you do pastoral ministry, it is all about listening to people, It's all about accompanying people, and it's all about integrating them back into the community once again. I will tell you that I was a bishop in Washington, D.C. 15 years ago, 16 years ago, I don't remember. But anyway, it was in a period when there was this great movement in the United States and in some aspects of the church to ban all Catholic politicians from receiving communion if they didn't agree 100% with. And we were supposed to put them outside of the church. Well, I was in Washington, D.C., and I used to say Mass almost every Sunday at the cathedral, where we had no parishioners, but we had probably at least 100 politicians or 200 politicians every Sunday morning. How in the name of God, I used to say, or what would Jesus do in this situation? Would he have put them all outside the church? Think about that for one moment. It was a crazy time. And we used to get letters. The Cardinal Archbishop used to get tons of mail every day about, this person should be put out of the church and that. He used to, one thing that always stuck in my mind, he'd always say, Kevin, why did they build a church anyway? Why did God create the church anyway? I thought it was for sinners. And then he wouldn't answer any of the letters. The church is for those who have sinned. Why and what's the idea? So that the church can bring them back into the community of those who believe. And for Pope Francis and for us, believing means living. It doesn't mean having the knowledge in our head. It means having the knowledge in our head, but living it in the reality of everyday life. So I tell you that as an example. People will tell you, those people, they're divorced. They shouldn't be going to church. They shouldn't be part of church. Who ever said that, and where did they say it? Did Jesus ever say that? What about the prodigal son? What about the adulterous woman? What about, God knows, the disciples on the way to Emmaus? No. That wasn't God. That wasn't Jesus. He died on the cross so that sinners would be saved. Redemption is for each and every one of us. And so, rather than explain to you what Amoris Laetitia is all about chapter by chapter, I would tell you that you should read it, but you should read it with that mentality, especially of the underlying principles of the gospel. You cannot read Amoris Laetitia without understanding and knowing the gospel and the person of Jesus Christ. It is, after all, our task as Christians to bring other Christians into contact with the person of Jesus Christ. And so in conclusion, my first request to you all is read chapters 1 through 9 in order. Don't read paragraph 351, 2, and 3 first. Read chapter 1, verse 1 first, and go through the whole thing. You want to know how difficult it is in marriage to love another person? Read chapter 4. Read chapter 4. He will tell you, Pope Francis, in his own personal life, he is revealed in an interview that, he had went through difficult times in his family. There were many difficult situations. After all, as he says, show me one family that was created in heaven perfect. Only one. The Holy Family. The only one. All the rest were people, ordinary people with challenges facing us every day, difficulties. We have pride, we have envy, we have our own personalities, and we're all different. Read chapter 4. It'll tell you there, it'll go through, be kind, what it means to be kind, what it means to be patient. It will mention it all. And you don't need a dictionary to read it. So I would hope that you would do that. The second thing that I would hope that you do in your parishes, make sure that all across our church, all across the world, that we use this document as a marriage preparation course. Couples should be explained, should read this. And I would request that you not have all the priests always doing marriage preparation. They have no credibility when it comes to living marriage, the reality of marriage. They may know the principles, they may know the values, they may speak to you of philosophy, of theology, but the reality of every day, every parish should have couples who are prepared, obviously, and I underline the word prepared, who teach and prepare and guide and accompany other married couples along the way of life. We are all brothers and sisters. We all suffer the same way. We all have the same difficulties and challenges. Let's share the good news with each other. And finally, I would hope that you would all support and gather together so that the church as a whole can do something about the greatest crisis affecting humanity today. It is the crisis of marriage, and it is the crisis of families. Let's not talk anymore about it. Let's not discuss it anymore. The reality exists. Let's do something about it. Pope Francis' intention and desire in bringing the World Gathering of the Families to Ireland, and he said this to me in June of this year. He said, "Do you know that I have read that Ireland sent missionaries?" He said, "I even had missionaries from Ireland, Irish priests in Buenos Aires, in Argentina. They sent missionaries all over the world. They Christianized many parts of Africa, some parts of Latin America, certainly North America, and I can attest to that. And how many other parts of the world? How many books have been written about how the Irish saved civilization? Of course, we're always good at talking about what we do. But there is a basis to that. We need, Pope Francis said, we need to ensure that they be part of the revolution of promoting, once again, marriage and family life in our world today. The situation in Northern Europe, which he referred to, and I just quote that, I didn't ask him which country or what countries he was talking about, in Northern Europe is drastic. You just have to read the statistics. We need to do something about it. That's why he chose Ireland to be the center of the next gathering of the families. I hope that you will all support it and that you not ever be afraid to voice your support for marriage and for family life in our world today. I thank you all. I thank you for what you do. I thank you for being here today, and may God bless you all in the future.
According to my watch, we have had our minute, and it's now 12 o'clock, and we'll be stopping this session at around 12:45, that is 1:45. So we move on to an eagerly anticipated element of our convention, and that is a panel discussion. And I want to welcome you all back to the hall, suitably refreshed, I hope. And let's continue with our reflections in the form of this panel discussion, which has a theme, and the theme is faith in the family. Now, we have a distinguished panel which comprises Cardinal Farrell, whom you heard earlier this morning. We are delighted to welcome to Belfast Archbishop Diarmuid Martin. Your Grace, you're most welcome. We have Sharon Haughey and Julieann. Now, this is where it gets difficult for a northerner. A northerner would say Moran, but I'm led to believe it'd be Moran. Am I right? Absolutely. There we go. These are little slight differences north-south. They don't really get in the way of us being friends, but we have to get the language right. Okay. So we're going to start with something a little bit different. Instead of me introducing the panelists and who they are and their background and their views about life generally, we have a different type of starter. And here's how we're going to do it. We would like each of you to say a few words of introduction about yourselves and just give us a short insight on one particular matter, and that is how you believe your family, your experience, your lived experience of family has influenced your faith. Okay? So we have two mics, which we can have Julieann and the Cardinal sharing one, and Your Grace and Sharon sharing the other one. I'm led to believe they're now active. Good. So let's just start then with Julieann. A little bit about who you are, Julieann, and this question of how you believe that your experience of family has influenced your faith.
Good afternoon. I'm Julieann, of course, and I work for the Society of Missionary Children. I'm mother to Daniel, and I think, if I can just very briefly, because the Cardinal touched on it earlier, I think the journey on the road to Emmaus, or Amos, speaks hugely to me as to what my family, my immediate family and my wider family, that was the parish, that did for me and my faith. Some 16 years ago, I actually thought I was on the road to Damascus. And unlike St. Paul, I wasn't torturing any Christians, but I thought I had a very Damascian moment in my faith journey. Like very many other people, I'm sure everybody can concur, I came out of a very faith-filled home. I went to a Catholic primary school, a Catholic secondary school. My father in particular would have formed the family faith in a very particular way, and if I have half the faith that that man had, I'll be doing very well. I journeyed on from school life into parish life. I was a proclaimer of the word, I was a Eucharistic minister, I was doing all the right things, and then I decided I'd travel the world, and I only got as far as the Channel Islands. And it was there I met my son's father, my husband. And things were lovely, and things were perfect, and marriage was wonderful. And I had come home to Ireland to get married in my own parish, because my parish had formed me. And I think for many people, they'll understand that sometimes lives can take a turn for whatever reasons that get in our way. And marriage became a very dangerous place for myself. So I made a very difficult decision to come home to Ireland, to my parish. And I'll say that I received nothing but love, support, and care from my family, from my parish, from my diocese, and in particular from my bishop. And that set me on a journey which brought me back to third level education, to discover for myself what it was that God wanted for me in my life, and why all of this could have possibly happened, and where am I going to go next with all of this. I went through that uncomfortable space of being at Mass on Sundays and wondering, is the wider parish looking at me? Now I know they weren't. It was only me looking at me. And in those kind of very heartfelt, sad, difficult moments, I had a very extraordinary experience. I had that personal encounter. And that's why I talk about the Damascus moment. It felt like St. Paul on the road. somewhere in all of that journey, with my family forming my faith, my parish forming my faith, my school forming my faith, I recognized Christ when he was speaking to me, telling me I'm not alone. I thought it was Damascus, but now I know it was Emmaus, because I had journeyed with him for so long as a child and as a young woman, and now as an adult. So I took that journey. I've studied hard, I've worked hard. I did not think I'd find myself doing the things I am now doing today. And I'd say all of that comes out of the foundations that were laid by not just, as I say, my parents, but at that wider family as well, the school that's family and the parish that's family. Thanks.
Thank you very, very much. Mr. Cardinal.
Well, I did not have as an exciting a life, but as most of you know, I was born and raised in Dublin. I grew up in a very, I would say, my mother was deeply religious person. My father was religious in his own way. But I grew up in an area called Drumna, which was, I would say, 99.9% Catholic. Everybody on the street where I was reared were Catholics. Never had any, interaction with anybody that wasn't. And all my life was in the parish. I mean, we knew all the priests. We walked out of the associates in the parish. The parish priest I never spoke to in 20 years. But the young associates in the parish, I mean, we'd go in and out of their house without them even knowing it. And we had but most of the kids around the neighborhood were like that. I began to think, what I wanted to do. This was in the 50s. And in the early 60s, I recall going to see President Kennedy's trip to Ireland. And I remember it very distinctly. I was deeply impressed by this person and the Peace Corps. And I actually wanted to join the Peace Corps, but of course I couldn't do that because I was Irish. I was an Irish citizen, and the Peace Corps at that time was only for American citizens. I wanted to join the Peace Corps, but then I ended up joining the priesthood because I was going to save Latin America. Well, I didn't exactly succeed in doing that. I eventually returned, but to stick to my family, I mean, that's where you learn the values. Even if they're not deeply religious. My mother, ran the parish. And I'm sure the priest wanted to run her out of the parish many times. And then she ran the Sisters of Mercy, the convent in Mourne Road, and worked there till, she finally passed on. But she was always very attentive to that, and my father was too. My father was, a nationalist in his terms. I guess that's not the correct word, is it? A Republican. He was convinced and made us all go and learn Gaelic and to the Gaeltacht and all of those kind of things that we never wanted to do. But for him, that was religion. But we learned values. And one of the values was always caring about the people on the road, the people around the neighborhood, the other kids, what they would do. I think these are values that today need to be, these are the values we need to teach in families. I then, as I said, I went on to become a priest. I worked in Mexico for 7 years, but then found my way back into Washington, D.C., where I worked with immigrants Spanish-speaking immigrants during the Reagan years of the wars in Central America. There were large numbers of Spanish-speaking immigrants from El Salvador and from Nicaragua. And the rest is kind of history. Now, at this stage of my life, when I thought I was about to retire, I ended up being changed from being the Bishop of Dallas to being to working in Rome. I don't know what I did wrong, but here I am. So that's it.
Thank you. And Archbishop Diarmuid.
My life is very similar to Cardinal's, except that I spent a large part of my life working in Rome, then was called from Rome, rather than being called. So I don't know what I did wrong there either. You know? I grew up in another suburb of Dublin, working class suburb, Ballyfermot. When we arrived there, there was nothing there. There was no school, no church, not even a shop. Occasional buses would take you into town. It was a very poor area. I remember one of the experiences that I had as a young boy was seeing my next door neighbours being evicted, being thrown out of their house onto the street. And I met the boy, who was 1 year younger than I. I met him about 2 weeks ago at a picnic for the World Meeting of Families, which the Bishop of Kildare and Loughlin organised. And we were talking, and he said, I've met him a couple of times since, and he said, you know, I was 1 year younger than you were, and when you grew out of your shoes, I always got them. And I met his sister in the church in Ballyfermot the other day at a ceremony for people who'd lost relatives through drug abuse. And I was then saying about the shoes, and she says, but you know, my mother's cakes or whatever it was, they came out over the back wall as well. So in the midst of all of this, there was a huge sense of solidarity. A little interlude. I have some Belfast stories. My father worked for a short time in Belfast, and my mother was in Belfast the night it was carpet bombed. And she had great stories about the bombing of Belfast. She said she was under the stairs with the lady where they were living, and my father was out. And at a certain stage, the doorbell rang, and she was so relieved that my father was back. But it was the vibrations of the bombing that made the doorbell ring. And she always told the story that she was talking to this landlady, and the landlady was telling her that she always went on Saturday to visit her sister. And she said she was in Purdysburn. And my mother said, is that at the seaside? And she said, no, it's the mental asylum. And she found herself in this situation. But the other story she tells, she had come from Dublin that morning. She arrived into Belfast. It was bombed. The next day she was evacuated, got across to where my grandmother lived in Buncrana, and she had in her hand something she left Dublin with. 6 fresh eggs, which were not disturbed at all. No, they were absolutely untouched. So now, in my case, I had good and bad relations with the local clergy. I was talking yesterday about we would all be brought, about 800 children, marched on the first Friday to the church for confession. You probably had the same. And we'd be there and we'd be quiet for a while. And then a little bit of noise would break out. And at a certain stage, there was a Father Daly, big man, who would come out of the confessional and seize on some poor young lad and say, I'm going to report you to the head brother. And then he would return after a few shouts to administer the mercy of God in the confession for a number of others. But I just talk about one figure that really influenced my family life and faith, and that was a nun. She was a little sister of the Assumption, French. And she arrived on our doorstep one morning and she said, to my mother, I need you to run a sewing class. And she said to my father, you have a car. I need you to go with Sister Kevin on Saturday afternoon begging. And this nun began to, first of all, she got the sewing class going. Now, in those days, for parents to make their own clothes was economic. It wouldn't be now. And I can remember my mother and my cousin and my aunt with cutting out patterns from newspapers in order to make these. And this went on. And then I can always remember, I was very young, listening to my mother and my aunt saying, these women, they need more. They've got children. They don't know how to look after their children. Could we get the local GP to come in and talk to them about hygiene and so on? And this then began to be a women's solidarity group, with one remarkable thing about it, that their husbands in the Dublin of those days would let them go out on their own on a Monday evening, which was quite remarkable. And that was the credit of the nuns. My mother then got frightened because this French nun would arrive with holy books and say, I want you to read that, and I want you to do that. She was quite a lady. And then one day she arrived and she said, I'm going. We want to open a first convent in New Zealand, and I'm going off to open it. And I never heard much more about her until I was made a bishop. And she wrote me a letter, and she remembered all the stories about myself and my brother. It was quite remarkable. She was really an extraordinary woman. And then I finally got a letter from France to say that she had died at 106 years of age. So but the one thing that taught me was about being out, being among the community. My brother and I were the only children on our street who finished second level school. We were by no means the most intelligent on the street, but that was, and to a great extent, my parents were very emphatic about the fact that education was extremely important for both of us. The other comment on family, and that'll be my last one, was I asked my priest secretary in Dublin, when did he actually see me for the first time, and what did he remember? And he said, I remember you in the pro-cathedral the day you were sort of installed, and you greeted your brother, and you said, my brother and I get on extremely well. That is probably due to the fact that for most of our lives, we lived 2,000 miles away from each other.
Thank you, Archbishop. And now, Sharon, tell us about yourself.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sharon Haughey. I'm originally from Warrenpoint in County Down, and I'm married to Stephen, who's a man from North Armagh. And I suppose my own faith background really began at home, very much loving home, unconditional love of my own parents, and again, really the faith of my mum. She was a great believer in the 9 Fridays, and she said she would go every Friday evening. Quite often we would go with her to 9 Fridays because there was always an issue in the family. And she said as soon as one issue was resolved, another one was looming. So she started the 9 Fridays whenever she moved to Warrenpoint and began her married life. And she's now 47 years married, and she's never missed one because there was always an issue to be dealt with. And as a child, I used to always say with my granny, my grandparents were a big influence on me, particularly my daddy's mummy. I used to stay with her, and she was a great granny, and I suppose I was the apple of her eye because I was the eldest. And whatever I want, I got. Including one day, a story my mum tells, but I don't remember, that as a child I had very curly hair. And for anyone who has curly hair, you realise it doesn't grow down, it only grows out. And I wanted long hair. And my granny made that come true. She put a towel around my head and a little bow round the top, and I could flick my hair. Much to my mother's annoyance when she was in the bakery and someone said, I see your daughter's with her granny today, down the town. And as she stepped out of the bakery and looked, there I was, hand in hand with my granny, in a pair of her high heels and a tea towel, and I was flicking my hair. So grannies can do anything. I started off at St Mary's College. That's where I teach at the minute. I'm a student of St Mary's College. I knew I wanted to teach from a very young age with a piece of red lino and chalk at my granny's. I went out into the world to teach, and I taught in school in Rostrevor, beautiful part of the world. And then I returned as a lecturer then to St Mary's. And I met my husband. My husband is Stephen. In our family tradition, my mother has 5 sisters. And it was customary at any family gathering that the 6 sisters would sit together. And if anyone went out with somebody, the information had to come to the 6 sisters. So who was he? Who was his mum and dad? What was her maiden name? Who was the granny? And when we were young, we used to think to ourselves, this is just interfering in our lives. You know, too much information. Not that you found out any of that information on a first or a second date, and they really would have put you off. But I met my husband in Spain on a holiday. And at the first family get-together, who was he? Nobody knew. They were aghast. And so everyone was sent out to find out the information, find out something about him, because we can't let her marry someone that we don't know anything about. And so eventually one of my mummy's sisters, her husband, knew his granddad, who had a shop. And so information came back. And this was before social media. And so I married Stephen. I got the go-ahead from the 6 sisters. He was fine to go ahead and to marry Stephen. And Stephen and I began our married life 14 years ago. And we have 2 boys. We waited a long time to have our children, 5 years. Painful experience for us both, and we were blessed now with 2 beautiful boys. And so really, my whole idea of faith is really about giving them what I had as a child. You know, the unconditional love of my own parents, and that connection with grandparents, which I think is very important. My mother-in-law lives next door. She's in her 80s, and she looks after my children after school. She told me as she was holding on to the wall last week, I said, what are you doing? She says, I'm practicing a Rabona. And for those of you who don't know what a Rabona is, it's a football kick. You have to hold one leg, go around. And she said she had to hold on to the wall to steady her. Because my second son said, Mummy, Granny's very good at Rabonas, but she's not so good in nets. And so that's my life. And again, for me, really faith is about family. The extended family. And my mum's sisters were quite right. Now that I have 2 boys of my own, I will interrogate. Because you do marry your husband's family and the 2 connect. And I think that family is so very important, and that's what I want to give my 2 boys. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, fellow delegates, if I could just make one observation. The common thread through what we've just heard is the concept of humility, and it's a wonderful thing to hear. Right, it's over to the delegates, and we try to do this in a sort of semi-structured way. Now, many of you have been so kind as to provide questions, in fact, in great numbers, too many questions for us to address in the short time we have. But we'll do our best. So I have questions that have been written and delivered, and I have them here. And Jim is somewhere about the place. There he is there, and Jim will help me at a later stage. Now, there were quite a number of questions which fell into this broad category. So I've lifted one, and I'm just going to ask this very, very broad question. The problem with the question is, I suspect the answer that would come could be a PhD thesis. So we've got to be very, very careful that it doesn't deliver into the PhD. We're looking for the absolute essence. And on this occasion, I'm going to ask the Cardinal and the Archbishop to just give us a flavour of the essence of this, because when you hear the question, you'll appreciate why I'm asking it of the Cardinal and the Archbishop. The question is, the most simple one was, tell us something more about the theology underpinning Amoris. So, Cardinal, would you go first?
Well, I spoke earlier this morning about 3 aspects of are two aspects of the theology of Amoris Laetitia, and that is that the one guiding principle in all of our lives as Catholics, as Christians, is the imitation of Christ, and our whole intent in life is to follow the values and the example. What made Christ do what he did? How did he do it? Our lives, if we believe in what he preached, impulses us in a certain way to act as he acted. And that's why I spoke about those three parables that I felt were essential to understand, so that you would understand the document of Amoris Laetitia. I spoke about the road to Emmaus. I spoke about the adulterous woman, the prodigal son. I could have also mentioned the Samaritan woman at the well who had 7 husbands, and how Jesus engaged her in a conversation. I think they are some of the points. The second theological underpinning is that Christ came on earth and died so that we would be saved. Salvation is for all of us. And, you know, we often say, or any time we go to receive the Eucharist at Mass, Lord, I am not worthy. Well, even the saints said that. And the ones of us who are not so saintly say the same thing. Nobody is truly worthy. We are all sinners. And if we say that there is no redemption for us, well then we're saying that Christ was a failure. His mission was a failure, because after all, that's why he came on earth, to save us. And so I think that is another point that's underlying the theology of Amoris, that Christ came to save us. Christ knows who we are. Christ understands the difficulties that we live through and we suffer through. And forgiveness is there for the asking. He never denied forgiveness to somebody who sincerely asked for it. So I think that they are just a few of the underlying principles. And now I forget what the rest of the question was, but Archbishop Martin's much better and older than I am.
I hope I'm wiser, that's it.
That we know.
The Gospel of tomorrow is about Jesus saying to the Pharisees, which of the two, the son who says, yes, I'll go and do the work, and then doesn't do it, and the other person says no, and then goes and does it, and which is the best? And then it comes then to Jesus and John the Baptist, that they were worried about the fact that Jesus hung around with sinners and prostitutes. And it's very interesting, because the Pharisees were those who had all the rules. Everything was set out. And they felt that that was their yes to what was demanded of them by their faith. But it actually was a trap, because they felt that they knew everything and had all the answers. The one thing they didn't have was what you were just talking about, the need to be saved. They had their own way of saving themselves. And the sinners and the prostitutes and the tax collectors, who became the friends of Jesus, they were the ones who said no in the beginning. They went their sinful ways. But they eventually ended up as the ones who did what was needed, because they had a sense of the need for God's mercy. And in the other, their attitude to John the Baptist, they found it difficult to criticize John the Baptist, because he kept the rules. He was very austere. But they found it very difficult to deal with Jesus, who seemed to be very generous in his interpretation of the law so that people could be saved. And this is still today, we probably come from a Catholic tradition which was to some extent legalistic. We felt that by doing certain things we would earn our salvation, rather than understanding that God's mercy is something that is so generous that it changes our entire logic about the way we look at things. When I was working in the Vatican, I worked with an amazing Vietnamese cardinal who had been in prison for over 13 years, and much of it in solitary confinement. And when he came to Rome, he was asked by Pope John Paul to preach the retreat to the cardinals. And he went off to prepare it for about a week. And I got a phone call from the Secretariat of State, and they said, could you ask the Cardinal to send us just the list of the chapters so we can put it into the program? He sent it to me, and I sent it to the Secretariat of State. And I knew I wouldn't have to wait very long to receive a phone call, because one of the chapters was entitled, Jesus Was Stupid. So you can imagine the reaction of these people. And they rang me up first of all to say, what is he talking about? He can't possibly use that title. And he said to me, go and tell your people to read the mercy parables in the gospel. Tell them about the woman who lost the coin, which was a tiny coin. She turned her house head over heels until she found it. And then what did she do? She threw a party which cost about 1,000 times what the coin. And he said, is that not stupid? You know? And in fact, this is what I mean by saying that Jesus' logic changes our logic. It relativizes some of the things that we accept as the norm. And we have to, if we want to change people's lives, we'll change them when they experience the church as a merciful church. They won't be changed by a church which is legalistic and condemnatory. And that's one of the great talents of Pope Francis. If you look at our society, it's very narcissistic in its domination. We try to paper over our narcissism by beauty products, by cults of the body, and so on. Jesus is the very opposite. And what we're being challenged, and what is the essence of being family, is not being inward looking, but by reaching out and by giving yourself. The second reading in the Mass tomorrow is that from Philippians, in which Jesus really tells us who our God is. Our God is someone who doesn't cling to prerogatives, but empties himself, gives himself. And Jesus attained that name which is above every other name by giving himself unto death.
Thank you very, very much. Listen, I think I'll continue with these questions I've received here, and I have a set of 3, and I'm going to read them out as a set, and then I'm going to ask some of our panelists here to pick them up, and they move on from the theology. So, one question, anonymous: families are often divided because of arguments, and time passes, making it difficult to reconcile. The question is, how can we heal wounds and deal with the anger we feel towards family members? Very honest question. The next question relates to the issue of marriage, and it refers to broken marriages. What is the church doing to include people in broken marriages? For example, in looking at the documentation around the World Meeting of Families, we see emphasis on the word marriage, couples, etc. So how can the divorced or the separated be brought into the spirit of the World Meeting of Families? And the next one is, again, practical. It relates to, the 2 questions go together. How can we enable or encourage priests in our diocese into reading Amoris, and especially if people are reticent to do that? So it's about basically the support coming for parishioners. And then, of course, will there be guidance, resources and support made available at parish level in regard to the document and indeed to the World Meeting of Families? So they're the 3 I pulled together So if I go back to the first one, which relates to family life and divisions and arguments, which I think everyone in this room will know are part and parcel of family life. Sharon, you spoke about your family, so maybe you'd like to address this question.
Thank you, Peter. Well, I'll tell you about this morning. I got up this morning at 4:30 when there was a call, "Mommy!" Bad dream. So I moved out of my own bed into my son's bed. I have that sorted out. I came down this morning, still in my dressing gown, and I stand on a pair of football boots, and I'm about to shout. I'm getting the breaths ready. I'm about to shout to the boys. And in my own head, I'm mumbling, "Sacred Heart," to which my young son at the top of the stairs says, "Of Jesus, I place all my trust in you." So the first row is averted, and there's my morning prayer. I go downstairs, and I'm at the computer, and this is all before 8 o'clock. And my husband was working on the computer last night, and I pressed the wrong button. He didn't save it. Second row was not averted. And so there were some words spoken, no breakfast plates broken. And then I get a call from my son, he can't get his football socks on. So I'm putting the talc in the football socks, and he says, "Mommy, I don't like it when you and Daddy row." And I said, "Well, rows are part of family life. You know, you and your brother row all the time." And he says, "But I can't divorce my brother." And I thought, 8 o'clock, it hasn't even come 8 o'clock. I'm averting one row, I've said my prayer, I've had a row with my husband, and now I'm dealing with a key question. And I said, "Where's that coming from?" When he talked about 2 boys in his class who had a stepmom and a stepdad. So that question I'll have to go back home to, you know, and address it with him, you know. And I said, "Daddy and I will make up. We always do. You know, we've had rows lots of times." So there was a frosty kiss on the way out. I get in the car, quite cross on the way down the road, got here eventually, and I was just about to turn off my phone, and the WhatsApp bleep, and there's a beautiful video of my husband and the 2 children. "Sorry, things were frosty this morning. Have a good day." And so I know when I go home, things will be easier. But that's part and parcel of life, the messiness of life. You know, arguments happen all the time, especially between siblings and between married couples. It's all part of growing up in the family. And so that's a very strong question. What happens, particularly in families, when there's anger or resentment and time passes? And I often think of the story of the prodigal son that was mentioned this morning, and we talk about that story with the unconditional love of the father and repentance, but I always wonder about the 2 brothers. You know, one took the inheritance and went off and had a great time. One stayed at home. And the prodigal son returns and the father rejoices. Funny, Jesus never mentions what happens in the relationship between the 2 boys. But I can imagine there's a lot of toing and froing and discussing and rows before that's mended. But it will be mended because that's family life. And I think in the document Amoris Laetitia, Pope Francis talks about 3 key words for the family. Please, thank you, and sorry. And in the small instances in life, the importance of saying sorry and the importance of forgiveness in family life. And again, one of the strong, strong messages of the gospel. Not 7, but 70 times 7 to forgive your brother and your sister. But forgiveness is difficult. It's not an easy thing to do. And sometimes forgiving yourself is much more difficult than forgiving others. And because the importance of family, there's always someone in the family who's good at mediation and maybe connecting to people in the family, mothers, fathers, the unconditional love in the family and the difficulties that arise. The importance of kind acts is a key factor in Amoris Laetitia. And again, the importance of forgiveness for yourself and for others.
Thank you. Thank you. Julieann, the message in this question was a perception that, well, some were welcome, some weren't. Now, only a perception, but the question is raising an important issue about the church and those who are separated or divorced. So would you like to comment on that?
I will. I'll try anyway. I think Cardinal Farrell earlier on today made a mention of the fact that it's the obligation upon the laity to preach the gospel into the reality of family life today. And I think, speaking perhaps from my own personal experience, and I know it's difficult, and I think you have to be a person of perhaps some strength or endeavour to stay in the conversation. If you don't go to the World Meeting of Families because you think there's a perception that you're not wanted there, then how will we change anything? I suppose another way I've often thought of the journey I've taken in what I've gone through myself and then returning to studying theology of all things. You know, it was just like, what am I doing here? But making that journey and then finding myself after that journey. I mean, I spent 6 years then working for the Irish Bishops' Conference. And as I say, from there I've gone from Episcopal to Pontifical. I now work for Pope Francis's Children's Charity. If somebody had said that to me back in 2001, 2002, I would have said, that's not for me. I'm not going to be in that space. I've gone through what I've gone through. The church doesn't want people like me. The church needs every one of us. I think what I hold really dear to is something in the Trinity. God is family, and so are we. And if there's a piece missing from God's family, there's a piece missing. And then it's not whole, and then it's not complete. And I think it's our task, no matter where we are, whether we're living life to its fullest and its wholest and its purest, or whether we're living our lives on the edges and find ourselves dropping in and out of states of grace. There's something missing if we're not there. And I think we have to find the strength, no matter who we are, whether we're single parents, whether we're people in, I have an Italian uncle who calls them fresh marriages. I think that's a lovely term for second relationships, but fresh marriages. Whether we're in second marriages, single relationships, wherever we are, if we're not there in the conversation, there's going to be something lacking from the conversation, something missing. And I think it's hugely important that we find the strength to stay in the conversation and to trust in Jesus, that we're meant to be there and meant to be part of the conversation. So I say find the courage to be there and find the courage to participate fully.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm going to hold back the third question in the set that I have because I'm very anxious to locate Jim in the crowd somewhere. If you could just raise. So Jim, are you? Yes. Can I just hand over to you then?
Yes, I have a question here from Catherine for the panel.
Is it important that as parish communities we consider how to accompany those who are in same-sex unions and those who identify as LGBT, questioning or intersex?
Okay, I think the question's very clear. Would anyone like to pick this one up from the panel? Yes, listen, maybe it's best it comes from the panel. Would you stand up, I think? Is it Catherine? Is it Catherine? Yes, Catherine. It's important we hear a question, and you raised the question. So would you take the mic again? Would you, yeah? And just go through the question again so that there's no misunderstanding about your question. But please do stand up. Thank you.
Is it important that as parish communities we consider how to accompany those who are in same-sex unions and those who identify as LGBT, questioning or intersex? Thank you.
Okay. Is that okay now?
Thank you. People who are same-sex, who have same-sex attraction, are not excluded in any way from the church and must be welcomed into the church. They are baptized Christians, and therefore, as such, they're just like you and I and everybody else. They are to be welcomed into the parish and into parish communities. it is important that we always have, Jesus, when he met with people, he didn't make distinctions between who was who and, you know, who was living according to the law of Moses and who wasn't living according to the law of Moses, or who was of one political association or of another political association, or who had one defect or another. All people are welcome to God. How we live that, of course, is also they need to be brought along to live the Catholic faith, but they do have to be accepted. The doors are open to everybody to be and should be welcomed within the church. LGBT communities and whether they be divorced and remarried, they are all welcome in the church. Nowhere should they be excluded from. And Pope Francis made that infamous statement on the plane one time, coming back from, I forget where he was coming back from. He said, "Who am I to judge these people? Who am I to judge?" Well, who are we to judge? And who is the parish committee to say that some people are welcome and some people are not welcome? When did Jesus ever give us that rule? So I believe that they're all must be welcome in the church.
Thank you very much.
I'm interested. The term welcome is extremely important. I have meetings with various groupings who come to my house and we'll have discussions. I had one recently with about talking about the next synod on young people, and a number of the young people there were gay and spoke. But the one thing they said is, I know you don't, you know, we differ on certain things, but at least I was made feel welcome here. I could say what I wanted to say. And very often the church is unwelcoming and unwilling to listen to people, or maybe to listen to them in a sort of a superficial way. And parish communities have to learn to know how you make people feel welcome, how you antagonize and alienate people. And in one of our reflections on young people in the church, young people said very often it's the people who are in the church and the priests who are the most unwelcoming. And we have to ask ourselves sometimes, would you feel welcome in the sort of parish communities that we have? And I think that's a question all of us should be asking. I have to come back to your comment and tell a story of a friend of mine. The husband and wife had a row in the morning, and a serious row. And the daughter was a little concerned. So she got her mother's cell phone and sent a message to her father, "I'm sorry." So he came home very happy that evening and suddenly realized that the situation wasn't quite as calm as he was expecting.
Very good. Wow. Well, there's the message, the power of technology in the hands of young people. Wow. Listen, we only had 45 minutes allocated to this. This could have gone on all day, but I know I'm getting a little nod here from the organisers about moving things along. So, Catherine, I want to thank you for standing up and raising a very important question about inclusivity. I want to conclude this session by thanking our panel, and I'd ask you to please to recognise their contribution in the normal way. And finally, I want to thank you, because I'm going to tell you something. When you're standing where I am, I can hear you listening. Now, I don't have any special powers or any spiritual powers about this, but I can hear you listening. I know the extent to which you're engaged with the questions and the answers, and I thank you very much for that. I think Paula wants to speak to you now in relation to the next set of arrangements. Thank you.